It all happened on a rainy night, one that I will never forget. The sky was dark, and the rain poured endlessly, tapping on the roof and windows like tiny drummers. Thunder occasionally roared, shaking the walls of my small house. I had always loved the rain. It was calming, soothing even. But that night, the rain didn't comfort me. Instead, it became the backdrop to one of the scariest experiences of my life. I lived alone in a small one-story house on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet neighborhood, and most of my neighbors were older people who went to bed early. That night, I had just finished dinner and decided to settle down with a good book. The rain was heavy, and the wind howled outside, but inside, everything was cozy. I lit a candle because the storm had knocked out the electricity earlier in the evening. The flickering light made shadows dance on the walls. I didn't mind. It gave the room a warm, golden glow. I wrapped myself in a blanket, made a cup of tea, and sat down to read. As I got lost in the story, the sound of the rain became a distant hum. The only other sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the trees outside. It was peaceful. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. It was faint, almost too soft to notice. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I paused and listened carefully. My heart started to beat faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the rain hitting a different part of the house. Or maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I went back to reading, trying to focus on the words in front of me. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder and clearer. Creak, creak. The sound was unmistakable now. It was the sound of someone walking. My heart raced. I looked around the room, the flickering candlelight making everything seem eerie. The sound didn't stop. It continued, slow and steady, as if someone was pacing back and forth. The problem was, the sound was coming from above me. I froze, my mind trying to make sense of what I was hearing. My house didn't have an upstairs. It was a single-story home. There was no reason for footsteps to be coming from above. Maybe it's the roof, I whispered to myself, trying to calm down. The wind is strong, and it could be shifting the tiles. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The sound wasn't random, like something being blown around by the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I stood up slowly, the blanket falling off my shoulders. The candle flickered as I moved, casting strange shadows on the walls. My hands were shaking as I picked up the flashlight from the table. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The sound of my own voice in the silent house made me feel even more nervous. There was no reply. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, listening. The only sound now was the rain tapping against the windows. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe it really had just been my imagination. But then it started again. Creak, creak, creak. The sound was louder this time, as if whatever, or whoever, it was wanted me to hear it. I felt a chill run down my spine. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an animal? But what kind of animal makes footsteps like that? Could someone have climbed onto my roof? But how would they even get up there in this weather? I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to check. Holding the flashlight tightly, I walked to the hallway that led to the attic door. I hadn't thought about the attic in years. It was more of a crawl space than an actual attic, just a small storage area above the ceiling. I never used it, and as far as I knew, it was completely empty. The attic door was a small square in the ceiling, with a pull-down ladder. I stared at it, my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely hear the rain. The footsteps continued, louder now, as if they were right above me. Taking a deep breath, I reached up and pulled the cord to lower the ladder. It creaked loudly, making me jump. The sound of the ladder unfolding seemed to echo through the house, and for a moment, the footsteps stopped again. I hesitated, shining the flashlight up into the dark opening of the attic. The beam of light revealed nothing but dusty wooden beams and cobwebs. I could feel the cold air coming down from the attic, and it smelled musty, like old wood and forgotten things. "Is anyone up there?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I climbed up slowly, the ladder creaking under my weight. The flashlight shook in my hand as I reached the top and shined it around the attic. It was just as I remembered, empty and covered in dust. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dust on the floor, there were footprints. They were small, like the footprints of a child, and they led from one end of the attic to the other. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I followed the footprints with my flashlight, my heart pounding harder with each step. They stopped at the edge of the attic, right where the wall met the floor. There was nothing there, no door, no window, no way in or out. And then, as I stood there staring, I heard it again. Creak, creak. The sound of footsteps, but this time they were behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking so much that the beam wavered. But there was nothing there. The attic was empty. Panicking, I climbed back down the ladder as fast as I could. I pulled it up and slammed the attic door shut, locking it. My hands were shaking so much that it took me a few tries to lock it properly. I ran back to the living room, grabbing my phone. My fingers fumbled as I tried to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't think straight. Who would I even call? The police? What would I say? As I stood there, trying to calm myself down, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't coming from the attic. They were coming down the hallway, heading toward me. I grabbed the candle and my flashlight, backing away toward the front door. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, just like before. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel something. It was like the air around me had changed, growing colder and heavier. The footsteps stopped just as I reached the front door. My hand was on the doorknob, ready to run outside into the storm, when I felt it. A breath. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone standing right behind me, breathing softly. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I opened the door and ran out into the rain. I stood in the yard, drenched and shivering, staring back at the house. The windows were dark, and everything looked quiet, just as it should. But I knew better. I stayed outside until the sun came up. When I finally went back inside, everything was as I had left it, except for one thing. The attic door was open. It was the summer of my 19th year, and my parents had left for a week-long vacation. They went to visit my grandparents in another state, leaving me in charge of the house. I was excited about having the house to myself for the first time. No rules, no curfews, and no one to tell me to clean up after myself. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it binge-watching my favorite TV shows, eating snacks, and enjoying the quiet. It was nice to have some alone time. On the second night, the house felt a bit too quiet. I didn't think much of it at first. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being alone. Normally, the house was filled with the sound of my parents talking, the TV in the background, or the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. Without those familiar noises, the silence felt almost heavy. Around 9 p.m., I decided to relax on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and a good movie. The house was dimly lit, and the soft glow of the TV was comforting. I was halfway through the movie when the phone rang. It was the landline. We rarely used it anymore, but we kept it for emergencies. I paused the movie and got up to answer. "Hello," I said, holding the phone to my ear. There was no response. "Hello," I repeated, a little louder this time. Nothing. Just silence. I frowned and hung up. It was probably a wrong number, I thought. Maybe someone had dialed the wrong house by accident. I went back to the couch, but the call had left me feeling uneasy. The silence on the other end of the line wasn't normal. It wasn't like someone had hesitated to speak. It was completely silent, like no one was there at all. Trying to shake off the weird feeling, I resumed my movie. About 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. I hesitated. For a moment, I thought about not answering. But what if it was important? What if it was my parents calling to check on me? I picked up the phone. "Hello." Again, there was no response. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice a little firmer. The silence stretched on for a few more seconds before I hung up again. My heart was beating faster now. Something about the calls didn't feel right. I sat back down, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe the phone was malfunctioning. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The phone didn't ring again for the rest of the night. Still, I slept with the lights on, just in case. The next day was quiet. I spent the morning cleaning up and the afternoon reading a book. By evening, I had almost forgotten about the strange phone calls. Around 8 p.m., just as I was getting ready to eat dinner, the phone rang again. I froze. My stomach twisted into a knot. I didn't want to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. "Hello." There was silence again, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it felt intentional, like someone was there listening. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Still, there was no reply. Just silence. "Stop calling me." I shouted before slamming the phone down. I stood there, staring at the phone, my heart racing. Who would keep calling and not say anything? Was it some kind of sick joke? I decided to unplug the landline. That would solve the problem, I thought. No more phone calls. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I felt a little better. The house was quiet, and I was starting to relax. But then my cell phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up and saw a text message from an unknown number. "Why did you stop answering?" My hands went cold. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. How did they get my cell phone number? I didn't reply. Instead, I locked my phone and put it face down on the nightstand. A minute later, it buzzed again. Another message from the same number. "I know you're home alone." My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I jumped out of bed and checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. My mind was spinning with fear. Who was this person? How did they know I was alone? Were they watching me? I tried calling my parents, but their phones went straight to voicemail. They were probably out of range, visiting my grandparents in the countryside. I felt completely alone. For the next hour, I sat in the living room with all the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife for protection. I didn't know what else to do. The phone buzzed again. Another text. "You shouldn't have unplugged the phone." Tears filled my eyes. I was terrified. This wasn't just a prank, it was something much worse. Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. I froze. The knock was soft but insistent. 3 gentle taps, followed by silence. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no reply. I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. Another knock came, this time from the back door. I ran to the kitchen and peeked out the window, but again, I couldn't see anyone. Whoever it was, they were playing with me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the phone. 911, what's your emergency?" the operator said. "There's someone outside my house," I whispered, trying to stay calm. "They keep knocking on the doors and sending me messages. I think they're watching me." The operator asked for my address and told me to stay on the line. She assured me that officers were on their way. As I spoke to her, I heard another knock. This time, it was coming from one of the windows. I turned toward the sound and saw a dark figure standing outside, just beyond the glass. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their gaze. They stood there for a few seconds before disappearing into the darkness. "The police are almost there," the operator said. "Stay inside and keep all the doors locked." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. When the police arrived, I ran outside to meet them. There were 2 officers, and they quickly searched the property. They didn't find anyone, but what they did find sent chills down my spine. There were muddy footprints all around the house. They led from the front door to the back door, then to the windows. Whoever it was had been circling the house, watching me the entire time. The officers said they would patrol the area and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. They told me to call them if I noticed anything unusual. After they left, I stayed up all night, too scared to sleep. The text messages stopped, and there were no more knocks on the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching me. When my parents returned a few days later, I told them everything. They were shocked and worried, but they tried to reassure me that it was probably just a random prank. I wanted to believe them, but deep down I knew the truth. Whoever it was, they knew too much. They knew I was alone. They knew I had unplugged the phone. And worst of all, they wanted me to know that they were there. Even now, years later, I still get nervous whenever the phone rings. I can't forget the silence on the other end of the line, or the text that said, "Why did you stop answering?" I'll never know who it was or what they wanted. But one thing is certain, I've never felt safe in that house again. It started on a Thursday evening, just like any other day. I had come home after a long day of work, tired and eager to relax. My small apartment was my safe space, my sanctuary from the noisy, crowded city outside. The air was cool, and the faint smell of rain lingered in the atmosphere. I kicked off my shoes, put my bag on the table, and went straight to the bathroom to wash my face. The mirror above the sink was slightly fogged up, as if it had been used recently, which I found strange. I lived alone, and I hadn't been home all day. I wiped the mirror with my hand, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a dark shadow behind me. It was faint and quick, almost like a flicker of movement. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The bathroom was empty. I laughed nervously at myself. "You're just tired," I muttered, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. That night, as I got ready for bed, I glanced at the full-length mirror in my bedroom. It was an old mirror, something I had picked up from a flea market a few months ago. Its wooden frame was carved with intricate designs, and the glass had a slightly worn antique look. I stood in front of it, brushing my hair, when I noticed something odd. My reflection seemed off. It wasn't delayed or distorted, but it felt like my reflection was watching me more intently than usual. I leaned closer, examining the mirror. My reflection copied me perfectly, as it should, but there was something about its eyes. They looked darker, deeper, almost like they belonged to someone else. I shook my head and stepped back. "It's just in your head," I told myself again. I turned off the light and climbed into bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was still watching me. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Every morning, when I looked in the bathroom mirror, it seemed as though my reflection was a little slower, just by a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, but once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. One evening, as I walked past the mirror in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of movement. It wasn't my reflection. It was something else. A dark shadow, quick and fleeting, just behind the glass. I froze, staring into the mirror. My own reflection stared back, looking as nervous as I felt. I stood there for what felt like minutes, but nothing happened. No movement, no shadows, just me. I shook my head and walked away, but the unease stayed with me. That weekend, things got worse. I had spent most of the day cleaning the apartment, trying to distract myself from the strange feelings I'd been having. By evening, I was exhausted. I decided to take a hot shower to relax. As the bathroom filled with steam, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. It was odd because the room was warm, almost humid. I turned off the water and stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around myself. When I looked into the mirror, I froze. My reflection wasn't moving. I raised my hand to touch my face, but the reflection just stood there, staring at me with an unsettling grin that didn't match my own expression. A cold wave of fear washed over me. "This isn't real," I whispered, but my voice sounded weak, even to my own ears. Then, slowly, the reflection tilted its head to one side, as if it were studying me. I backed away, my heart pounding. I didn't take my eyes off the mirror as I grabbed the doorknob and fled the bathroom. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, avoiding every reflective surface in the house. I even covered the mirrors with towels and blankets, hoping that would make me feel safer. But it didn't. As I sat on the couch, trying to calm myself, I heard a faint sound. It was soft, like a whisper, coming from the direction of my bedroom. "No," I told myself. "It's just the wind." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I forced myself to go into the bedroom. The light was off, but the moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the room enough for me to see. The mirror was uncovered. I was sure I had covered it earlier, but now the blanket was on the floor. My reflection stood in the glass, staring back at me. But it wasn't copying my movements. It smiled. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called my friend Sarah. She picked up after a few rings. "Hey, what's up?" she asked. "Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. "Something's wrong. I think there's something in my mirrors." There was a pause on the other end. "What do you mean?" I told her everything, the shadows, the slow reflections, the grin in the bathroom mirror. I expected her to laugh or tell me I was imagining things, but instead, she was quiet. "Are you still there?" I asked. "Yes," she said softly. "Listen, I've heard stories about mirrors like that. Old mirrors. Sometimes they keep things inside them, or let things through." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What am I supposed to do?" "Get rid of it," she said firmly. "Throw it out, break it, whatever you have to do. Just get it out of your house." The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I didn't care how beautiful or expensive it was. I just wanted it gone. I wrapped the mirror in a blanket and carried it outside to the dumpster behind my building. The glass felt cold, almost unnaturally so, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me even though it was covered. When I reached the dumpster, I hesitated for a moment. What if getting rid of it made things worse? What if it came back? I shook off the thought and threw the mirror into the dumpster. The sound of the glass shattering was strangely satisfying. For the next few days, everything seemed normal. The house felt lighter, less oppressive. I stopped seeing shadows in the corners of my eyes, and my reflection behaved like it was supposed to. I thought it was over. But then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. The small mirror in my bathroom, the one I hadn't touched in days, had a crack running through it. And in the crack, I saw a shadow. It was faint, but it was there. And then it smiled. It was a chilly winter evening, and the first snow of the season was falling outside. I had just moved into my new house, a cozy little place at the edge of town. It wasn't too big, but it had enough space for me to feel comfortable. The house had its charm: wooden floors, an old brick fireplace, and an attic. I wasn't a fan of attics, to be honest. They always gave me a strange feeling, but I told myself I was being silly. After unpacking most of my things, I made myself a cup of tea and settled down in the living room. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creaks of the floorboards. I figured it was just the house settling, as old houses often do. Later that evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft thump coming from above. I paused, listening carefully. Thump. It came again, louder this time. I looked up at the ceiling. It sounded like it was coming from the attic. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a raccoon or a squirrel that had found its way inside. Old houses often had small gaps or openings where animals could sneak in. Still, the thought of something moving up there made me uneasy. I decided to ignore it for now. I would check it out tomorrow, during the daytime, when everything felt less creepy. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, and every little sound seemed louder than it should be. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. Thump. This time, it was followed by what sounded like faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the attic floor. My heart started pounding. It didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too heavy, too human. I pulled the covers up to my chin and lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps continued for a few minutes, then stopped. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, holding a flashlight in one hand and a broom in the other. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I wanted to be prepared for anything. The attic door was a small wooden panel in the ceiling. I pulled the cord to lower the ladder and climbed up slowly, my heart racing with every step. When I reached the top, I shone the flashlight around the attic. It was empty. There were a few old boxes left behind by the previous owners and some cobwebs in the corners, but nothing that could explain the noises. I sighed in relief. See, nothing to be afraid of, I said to myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air in the attic felt heavy, like something was watching me. I quickly climbed back down, closed the attic door, and tried to push the thought out of my mind. For the next few days, everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, and I started to feel more at ease. But then, one night, the noises came back. It started with the soft thumps, followed by the footsteps. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. I sat up in bed, clutching the blankets. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a burglar? A squatter? I decided to call the police. When the officers arrived, I explained what I had heard. They searched the attic thoroughly, but once again, they found nothing. There's no one up there, one of the officers said. It's probably just the house settling, or maybe some small animals. I nodded, but I didn't feel convinced. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump, and I kept glancing at the ceiling, half expecting to hear the footsteps again. At around 3 a.m., I heard a new sound. It was a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was coming from the attic. The whispers were soft and low, like two people talking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tones sent chills down my spine. I stayed in bed, frozen with fear, until the whispers stopped. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed a bag and planned to spend the night at a friend's place. But as I was getting ready to leave, I heard the attic door creak. I froze. Slowly, I turned to look at the ceiling. The attic door was slightly open, and the ladder was partially lowered. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and called Sarah, my best friend. "Something's in the attic," I whispered. "I'm leaving right now." "Wait for me," Sarah said. "I'm coming over." Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, and I was relieved to see her. Together, we decided to check the attic one last time. Armed with flashlights and a baseball bat, we climbed the ladder. The attic was quiet, just like before, but this time, something was different. There were footprints in the dust on the floor. They weren't mine or Sarah's, they were too large, and they led to a corner of the attic where the boxes were stacked. We approached the corner cautiously. As we moved the boxes aside, we found something that made my blood run cold. It was a small wooden door, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. The edges of the door were scratched, as if someone had been trying to claw their way in or out. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied. We didn't open the door. Instead, we climbed back down and called the police again. When the officers arrived, they examined the small door in the attic. Behind it, they found a narrow crawl space that led to an old vent. There was no sign of anyone, but they found strange markings on the walls of the crawl space, symbols carved into the wood, along with what looked like scratch marks. The police couldn't explain what the symbols meant or why they were there. They told me it was probably nothing to worry about, but I could tell they were just as unsettled as I was. That was the last night I spent in that house. I moved out the next week, leaving most of my things behind. Whatever was in that attic, I didn't want to find out. Even now, I sometimes hear the sound of footsteps when I'm alone. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. Something was in that attic, and it's still out there. It all started when I moved into my grandmother's old house. She had passed away a few months earlier, leaving the house to me. It wasn't big or fancy, but it held memories of my childhood visits, and I was happy to make it my home. The house was filled with old furniture, pictures, and trinkets from my grandmother's life. As I unpacked and sorted through her belongings, I came across an old wooden trunk in the attic. The trunk was heavy and covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Curious, I opened it to see what was inside. The trunk was filled with random items, clothes, letters, and a few toys. But one thing caught my eye immediately, a doll. The doll was small, about the size of a baby, and dressed in a faded pink dress. Its porcelain face was cracked in places, and its glass eyes seemed too real, as if they were watching me. I picked it up, feeling a strange chill run through my body. There was something unsettling about the doll, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I decided to leave it on a shelf in the living room as a decoration. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was quiet, and I was settling in comfortably. But after a few days, strange things started happening. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, I noticed the doll had moved. I had left it sitting upright on the shelf, but now it was lying on its side. Maybe it fell over, I thought. The shelf wasn't very stable, so it was possible. I picked the doll up and placed it back on the shelf. That evening, when I came home, the doll was sitting in a different position again. This time, it was facing the wall, as if it had turned around. I felt a small knot of unease in my stomach. Did I move it and forget? I wondered. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was being silly. A few nights later, I was sitting in the living room, watching TV. The doll was still on the shelf, and I couldn't help but glance at it every now and then. Its glass eyes seemed to catch the light, making it look like it was watching me. Suddenly, I heard a soft thud. I looked over and saw the doll lying on the floor. It had fallen from the shelf, but the strange thing was that it wasn't near the edge. There was no reason for it to fall. I picked it up and placed it back on the shelf, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. The following day, I started noticing other strange things around the house. Doors that I was sure I had closed were left slightly open. Lights flickered for no reason. And sometimes, I thought I heard faint whispers when I was alone. One evening, as I was cleaning the house, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a soft giggle, coming from the living room. I froze, my heart pounding. I slowly walked into the living room, but it was empty. The TV was off, and the house was silent. The doll was still on the shelf, but it looked different. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, and its glass eyes seemed to be staring right at me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was watching me. Over the next few days, the activity grew worse. I started hearing footsteps in the hallway at night. At first, I thought it was the creaking of the old wooden floors, but the sounds were too deliberate, too heavy. One night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching. It was faint but constant, like nails on wood. I turned on the light and listened carefully. The sound was coming from the living room. My heart raced as I got out of bed and walked toward the noise. When I entered the living room, the scratching stopped. The doll was no longer on the shelf. I found it lying on the floor, face down, with one of its tiny porcelain hands resting against the wall. It looked as though it had been trying to scratch something into the wood. I picked it up, feeling a strange mix of fear and anger. This is just a coincidence, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. The final straw came a few nights later. I had just gotten into bed when I heard a loud crash from the living room. I jumped out of bed and ran to see what had happened. The shelf where the doll had been sitting was tipped over, and everything on it was scattered across the floor. In the middle of the mess was the doll, sitting upright as if it had been placed there deliberately. Its glass eyes seemed to glint in the dim light, and for the first time, I thought I saw its lips curl into a faint smile. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the doll and threw it into a box, sealing it shut with tape. I left the box in the garage, far away from the house. The house felt lighter after that, as if a dark presence had been lifted. For a few days, everything was normal. I started to relax, thinking that whatever had been happening was over. But one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it. A soft giggle, coming from the garage. Terrified, I called my friend Sarah and told her everything. "I think the doll is haunted," I said, my voice trembling. "You need to get rid of it," Sarah said firmly. "Take it far away, bury it, or burn it. Just don't keep it in the house." The next morning, I took the box with the doll and drove out to a nearby forest. I dug a deep hole and buried the box, making sure it was completely covered. As I stood there, staring at the freshly dug dirt, I felt a strange sense of relief. "It's over," I whispered to myself. But it wasn't. A week later, I came home to find the doll sitting on the living room shelf, exactly where it had been before. My blood turned cold. I don't know how it got back, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that the doll is watching me, and no matter what I do, I can't get rid of it. It was a quiet summer evening. The air was warm, and the street outside was calm. I had just moved into a small house in the suburbs. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect for me. A cozy place where I could have my peace and privacy. The house had big windows in the living room. They faced the street, and during the day, the sunlight streamed in beautifully. At night, though, the large windows felt different. They gave me a strange feeling, like someone could be watching me from the outside. Still, I told myself it was just nerves. Moving into a new place could be unsettling, and I was sure I'd get used to it. That night, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch to relax. The curtains were open, and I could see the streetlights shining faintly outside. Everything was quiet, except for the occasional hum of cars passing by. As I sipped my tea, I glanced at the window and froze. There was a shadow. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light or a tree branch swaying in the wind. I leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The shadow didn't move. It was shaped like a person, standing perfectly still just outside the window. My heart started pounding. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. The shadow disappeared. I let out a shaky laugh. "It's nothing," I said to myself. "Just my imagination." I closed the curtains tightly and went to bed, trying to forget about it. The next day, I felt silly for being so scared. It was probably just a neighbor walking by or a trick of the light. I went about my day as usual, running errands and cleaning the house. But that evening, as the sun went down, I started to feel uneasy again. I made sure the curtains were closed before it got dark. I didn't want to see anything outside the window. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint tapping sounds, like someone lightly knocking on the window. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses make noises, I thought. It's just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The room was silent, but I felt like something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard it again. Tap, tap. It was coming from the living room window. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The tapping was soft but steady, like someone gently knocking on the glass. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I walked toward the living room. When I reached the window, the tapping stopped. I pulled the curtain aside and shone the light outside. There was nothing there. But as I turned to go back to bed, I felt it. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I had the strange sensation that someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The next morning, I called my friend Sarah and told her what had happened. "Maybe it's just your nerves," she said. "Moving into a new place can be stressful." "I don't know," I replied. It felt so real, like someone was really there. "Do you want me to come over tonight?" Sarah asked. "No, it's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. That evening, I made sure every door and window was locked. I closed all the curtains tightly and turned on every light in the house. For a while, everything seemed normal. I sat on the couch, watching TV and trying to distract myself. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The shadow. It was back, standing just outside the living room window. This time, it was moving. The shadow swayed slightly, as if it were rocking back and forth. Its shape was tall and thin, and it looked like it was wearing a long coat or cloak. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Sarah, it's back," I whispered. "What's back?" she asked. "The shadow. It's outside my window." "Stay on the phone with me," Sarah said. "I'm coming over right now." As I waited for Sarah, I kept my eyes on the window. The shadow didn't move closer, but it didn't go away either. Finally, I heard Sarah's car pull into the driveway. She knocked on the door, and I let her in, feeling a wave of relief. Together, we went to the window and pulled back the curtain. The shadow was gone. "I swear, it was right there," I said, my voice trembling. "I believe you," Sarah said. "Maybe it's someone playing a prank." We checked around the house and yard, but we didn't find anything unusual. The next few nights, the shadow didn't appear, and I started to think maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was just someone playing a prank, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then one night, something happened that I couldn't explain. I was lying in bed when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a soft, raspy whisper. "Let me in," the voice said. I sat up, my heart racing. The whisper was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I walked toward the sound. When I reached the living room, I saw it. The shadow wasn't outside the window this time. It was inside the house. It stood in the corner of the room, its dark form blending into the shadows. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I could feel the shadow moving closer. I ran to the bedroom and locked the door, my heart pounding. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Let me in." I stayed in the bedroom until morning, too scared to move. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door cautiously. The living room was empty, and the shadow was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. The shadow wasn't just outside my window. It was inside my house now, and it wasn't going to leave. Since that night, I've tried everything to get rid of the shadow. I've saged the house, called a priest, and even thought about moving. But no matter what I do, I can still feel its presence. At night, I hear the whispers. During the day, I see its shadow in the corners of the room. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but one thing is certain. The shadow is always watching. It was a quiet Saturday night in the summer of 2003. I was 15 years old, tall for my age at about 5 feet 10 inches, and weighed around 135 pounds. I played football for my high school, which gave me some confidence, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I was babysitting my little cousin Jake, who was 8 years old. We were at his family's home, a modest 2-story house located on the outskirts of town. It was a peaceful area, surrounded by trees, with only a few houses scattered around the neighborhood. That night, my mom and aunt were out shopping, and my dad and uncle were at the movies. They left me in charge, thinking it would be an easy few hours. Jake and I were sitting in the living room, the TV glowing softly as we watched cartoons. It was around 9 p.m., and the house was quiet except for the sound of the TV. The night seemed normal enough, but as we sat there, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a strange sense that something wasn't right. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't shake the creeping anxiety that something bad was going to happen. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. After a while, I got up, telling Jake I was just going to check something. I walked to the back door, making sure it was locked. It was one of those older-style sliding glass doors, with a flimsy latch that always made me nervous. I pushed it to make sure it wouldn't budge, then slid the security bar into place for extra precaution. As I walked back through the kitchen toward the living room, I glanced at the window over the sink, and that's when I saw him. There was a man standing just outside the window, staring into the house. He looked awful. His clothes were torn and filthy, hanging off his bony frame. His face was gaunt, with deep, sunken eyes that locked onto Jake, who was still sitting on the couch, completely unaware of what was happening. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a split second, I couldn't move or think. My brain felt like it was short-circuiting, trying to process what I was seeing. I quickly snapped out of it, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't want to scare Jake. If he saw the man and started panicking, it would make things worse. I walked back into the living room, pretending like everything was fine. "Hey, Jake," I said casually, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's head upstairs. Your mom and dad will be home soon, and they won't want you staying up too late." Jake groaned, but didn't argue. He grabbed his stuffed dinosaur and followed me upstairs to his bedroom. Once we were in his room, I told him to get into bed. "Just lie down and try to sleep," I said. "I'll stay here until your parents get back." He looked confused, but didn't question me. I tucked him in, turned off the light, and sat down on the floor by the door. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking, but I tried to look calm for Jake's sake. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check if the man was still there. I grabbed the meat tenderizer from the kitchen earlier, one of those heavy metal ones with spikes on one side. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing I could think of that might be useful as a weapon. I crept back downstairs, gripping the tenderizer tightly in my hand. When I reached the kitchen window, the man was gone. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe he had just wandered off. But that relief didn't last long. I knew I couldn't let my guard down. I walked to the front door and checked the locks. Both the deadbolt and the knob were secure. I double-checked every window and door on the ground floor, making sure everything was locked. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like someone tapping on glass. My stomach dropped. The sound was coming from the back door. I turned around slowly, every muscle in my body tensed. Through the sheer curtains over the sliding glass door, I could see a shadow moving. He was back. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't want to take my eyes off the door, but I forced myself to turn and run back upstairs. Once I was in Jake's room, I locked the door and sat down in front of it. Jake was still awake, looking at me with wide, scared eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," I lied. "Just stay under the covers, okay? Don't make a sound." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My voice was shaking as I explained what was happening. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that officers were on their way, but it would take them at least 20 minutes to get there. After hanging up, I called my dad and uncle. They were at the movie theater in town, about 30 minutes away. My dad said they would leave right away and get to the house as fast as they could. I sat there, clutching the meat tenderizer, trying to stay calm. Jake was silent under the covers, just as I'd told him. Then I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. Glass shattering. The man was inside. I could hear heavy boots on the floor below, moving slowly. The sound echoed through the house, each step deliberate and terrifying. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps moved through the living room, then into the kitchen. He was searching the house, room by room. I tightened my grip on the tenderizer, my palms sweaty. My mind raced with thoughts of what I would do if he came upstairs. I didn't have much of a plan. I was just hoping the police or my dad would get here before he found us. After a few minutes, the footsteps started climbing the stairs. I thought my heart was going to stop. The man was coming closer. I could hear him opening doors, first the guest bedroom, then the bathroom. He was checking every room on the second floor. When he reached Jake's room, he paused. I held my breath, my entire body frozen with fear. But then, instead of trying to open the door, he moved on. I heard his footsteps retreating down the stairs. I stayed where I was, too scared to move. Jake was trembling under the covers, but he didn't make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the man walking toward the basement door. There was a creak as he opened it, followed by the sound of his boots descending the stairs. I didn't know what to do. Should I try to lock him in the basement? Should I wait for the police? Every second felt like an hour as I sat there, listening for any sign that he was coming back up. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as the sound grew louder. The police arrived quickly, bursting into the house with flashlights and weapons drawn. They found the man hiding in the basement, crouched in the corner like an animal. Later, I learned that he was an escapee from a mental hospital in the next state over. He had been wandering the area for days, breaking into houses and stealing food. That night could have ended much differently, but I was lucky. After the police took him away, I stayed at Jake's side until my dad and uncle arrived. They hugged me tightly, telling me how proud they were of how I'd handled the situation. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak and shadow made my heart race. But over time, the fear faded, and life went back to normal. Even now, years later, I can still remember the man's face. And I'll never forget the sound of those boots on the floor. It was one of those quiet mornings, the kind that you'd expect from a small rural town. The sun was barely up, casting a soft golden hue across the wide open fields that surrounded my friend's house. His name was Andy. We weren't super close friends, but we had known each other for years through our families. I had come over to his place to hang out, and we were sipping coffee on his back porch, just talking about the usual stuff. Andy lived alone in a large 2-story house, nestled on the edge of town. The house itself wasn't exactly new, but had a certain charm about it. The backyard was vast, perfect for the kind of guy Andy was, outdoorsy, into guns, and loved to shoot. He often used his backyard as a gun range, practicing with everything from pistols to rifles. There was an old barn in the back, but it wasn't used for anything at the time, just another feature of his property. That morning, we were chatting about a hunting trip that we were planning for the fall when Andy froze mid-sentence. I didn't think much of it at first. He was always looking out for wildlife or birds, sometimes even just the wind moving the trees. But then he quickly stood up from his chair, staring toward the tree line at the far end of his property. I followed his gaze. Out of the woods came a man. He was large, unkempt, and wild-looking, like someone who had been living in the woods for weeks. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his posture was strange, like he had been crawling or stumbling for some time. It was early in the morning, so the air was still and quiet. There was something deeply unsettling about the way this man moved, almost like he was being drawn to the house with some kind of purpose. His eyes were fixed, unwavering, locked on the house as he emerged from the trees. "Is that guy coming here?" I asked, though I could already tell the answer. The man was now jogging toward the house, his movements erratic and urgent, but with a menacing undertone. Andy's face hardened. He wasn't just startled anymore. There was a look of grim understanding in his eyes. He had lived alone for years and was no stranger to the rural life. But something about the way the man was moving, it wasn't right. Without saying a word, Andy turned and bolted for the house. I followed him, my heart racing, unsure of what was happening. As we entered through the back door, Andy was already locking it. He moved quickly, securing the door and closing the blinds. I was standing there, trying to process what was going on. Was the guy just a trespasser? Someone lost or in trouble? It didn't feel like that. There was a sense of intent in the way he was running, a sense of malice that I couldn't ignore. Andy grabbed his phone from the kitchen counter and dialed the police. His voice was calm but firm as he explained the situation. I could hear the dispatcher's voice in the background, and then Andy hung up. The police were on their way, but it would take them some time to get to Andy's house, especially considering how far out it was. Andy wasn't taking any chances. He moved to the hallway closet, pulling out a small security gun from the shelf. He was always prepared, always ready. I didn't know much about guns, but I knew enough to recognize the seriousness in Andy's actions. He was trying to protect us, protect his home. He didn't say a word as he grabbed a few rounds from a drawer and loaded the gun. I felt uneasy standing there, unsure of what to do. The man had almost reached the house by now, still running toward the back. We could hear him banging against the back door, pushing on the windows. I could hear the tension in Andy's movements as he positioned himself by the front door. But here's where things got worse. What neither of us knew at the time was that the man hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. He had already been in the house. The basement window had been left slightly open the night before, just enough for the man to sneak in. It wasn't until later, when the police came, that they pieced everything together. The man had been hiding in the basement, lying in wait for the better part of a day, until he decided to make his move. And now, as Andy and I were standing upstairs, locking ourselves in the hallway, the intruder was slowly making his way up the stairs. Andy stood still, gun in hand, waiting. The sound of footsteps from the basement grew louder, heavier. Each creak of the floorboards, each echo of movement sent a chill down my spine. The door to the basement opened with a faint squeak, and then silence. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, the man stepped into view. He was even more terrifying up close. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and unblinking. His face was contorted into some kind of angry grin, and he was dragging his foot as he moved down the hallway toward us. Andy didn't hesitate. He raised the gun, his hand steady, and pulled the trigger. The first round was rock salt, meant to hurt, to send a message. The man flinched, but instead of retreating, he seemed to get angrier. The rock salt hadn't slowed him down. His eyes never left Andy. Andy fired again, this time, a rubber bullet aimed at the man's chest. I expected the force to knock him back or make him stumble, but instead, the man didn't even flinch. He just kept coming. By now, the man was close enough that I could hear his breathing, labored and uneven. He was a huge guy, probably over 6 feet tall, and even though he was clearly out of his mind, there was no denying the power he had behind his movements. It was like he wasn't feeling anything. The third shot was the one that made everything change. I'm not sure if Andy used a buckshot, a slug, or one of his rifles, but the impact was devastating. The blast left a hole in the man's chest. He staggered, still coming at us, his blood spilling out as he reached for Andy. It was too late for Andy to run or retreat. The man was on him in an instant. Despite the gunshot wound, the intruder tackled Andy to the ground. Andy struggled to free himself, his hand still holding the gun, trying to push the man off. I watched in horror as they wrestled. The man, seemingly invincible, continued to fight even after his wound, his strength unrelenting. Finally, Andy managed to push the man off, but the intruder collapsed right on top of him. Andy struggled beneath him, trying to free himself, but the man's weight was too much. There was nothing Andy could do. I couldn't move, I couldn't even scream. All I could do was watch as the man's life drained away on top of my friend. The sound of sirens finally reached us, but it was too late. The police arrived moments later, and the man was already dead. Andy had been pinned down by his weight for what felt like forever, but in the end, he was okay. Physically, at least. The aftermath was like a bad dream. The police investigation revealed that the man had escaped from a mental hospital just days before, in Baltimore, and had made his way north. He was mentally unstable, and it seemed he had been wandering for days, possibly weeks. He had broken into Andy's basement, taken shelter there, and planned his next move. The news of the incident made local headlines, and for a while, there was an ongoing investigation. But in the end, Andy was cleared of any wrongdoing. He had acted in self-defense, and the police confirmed that there had been no other choice. The whole situation was a nightmare, but Andy had done what he had to do. As for me, I didn't speak to Andy much after that. I didn't know how to. I kept in touch with his parents, who were understandably shaken by the whole ordeal, but Andy seemed to retreat into himself after that day. I can't even imagine what it did to him. The man had been hiding in his basement for at least a day, and it wasn't just the physical trauma that must have haunted him. I know Andy still lives in that house, though things aren't quite the same. There's a look in his eyes now, a guardedness. He goes through the motions, but I don't think he'll ever truly be the same after what happened. I'll never forget that morning. The sun shining, the coffee, and the moment everything shifted from normal to something I'll never be able to fully understand. And the man who came out of the woods, a memory that will stay with me forever. It was a typical Friday evening. I was 17 years old, home alone for the weekend while my parents had gone away to visit my aunt in another town. They had asked me to come along, but I decided to stay home, as I didn't mind being alone. I enjoyed the peace and quiet of my house, and I could do whatever I wanted. Plus, I liked the freedom of not having to follow any rules for a couple of days. My house was pretty old. It was built in the late 1800s, and although it had been well kept, it had that creaky old house charm. The floorboards would groan under your feet, and the windows would rattle in the wind. The house always had a slightly eerie feel to it, but I was used to it by now. I'd lived here my whole life. That night, after dinner, I was lounging on the couch in the living room. I had my phone in my hands, scrolling through social media, checking my messages. The TV was on, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. The house was quiet, like it always was when my parents were away. I liked the calm, and I found it peaceful. I hadn't noticed anything strange or out of place at first. But then, as I sat there, I started to hear something. It was a soft sound, almost like a tapping or a knocking. At first, I thought it was just a random noise, maybe something outside, a bird or an animal, or even the house settling. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough that I couldn't ignore it. Tap, tap, tap. Then a short pause. Tap, tap, tap again. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was nothing. After all, old houses make all sorts of noises. Maybe it was just a loose piece of wood in the wall, or something like that. But the noise continued. It didn't stop. I found myself listening to it, trying to figure out what it was. It wasn't the wind or any of the usual noises that the house made. This was different. It was rhythmic, like someone was knocking from the inside. I tried to focus on my phone again, but it was hard to ignore the tapping. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was just past 8:30 p.m. My parents wouldn't be back for hours. The tapping noise didn't stop. It was steady and persistent. Something about it made me uneasy. I stood up from the couch, my phone still in hand, and walked over to the hallway. The noise seemed to be coming from the direction of the back of the house, near the kitchen. I glanced around, but there was nothing unusual. I decided to check the windows. I didn't know why, but I felt like something was wrong. I pulled back the curtains of the living room window and looked outside, but everything seemed normal. The yard was dark, but the streetlights outside gave enough light to see that there was nothing there. Still, the tapping continued, and it was getting louder. Now, I was starting to feel a little anxious. It wasn't just a tapping anymore. It had turned into a scraping sound. It was coming from inside the walls, and it seemed to be getting closer. My heart started to race. I walked over to the kitchen door, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. As I stood in the kitchen, the noise was louder, and it seemed to be coming from behind the walls. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The house was old, and the electricity would sometimes flicker when the wind blew, so I always kept a flashlight on hand. I turned it on and began to walk around, following the sound. It was definitely coming from the walls, but I couldn't figure out where exactly. I decided to go downstairs to the basement. The noise seemed to be louder from there, so I thought maybe something had gotten stuck in the walls, or there was some kind of animal or rodent. My heart was still racing, but I kept telling myself it was nothing to be afraid of. It was just an animal, probably a squirrel or a mouse. The basement was dark and cold, but I wasn't scared. I had been down there a million times. I opened the basement door slowly, making sure to make as little noise as possible. The stairs creaked as I descended. I turned on the flashlight, scanning the dark basement. The sound of the tapping was louder now, almost deafening. It was coming from behind the wall near the furnace. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I took a step forward, shining the flashlight on the walls, but there was nothing there. The noise seemed to be coming from the far corner of the basement. I walked over to the furnace, feeling my heart beat faster with each step. The room was small, and the shadows cast by the flashlight made the space feel even more claustrophobic. I looked around, my eyes scanning every inch of the room. Then, I heard it again, the tapping, right behind the furnace. It was louder now, almost as if whatever it was knocking against the wall. I slowly reached down to grab the handle of the furnace, preparing to move it, when the flashlight flickered. For a moment, everything went dark. My heart jumped into my throat, and I froze. I quickly shook the flashlight, trying to get it to work again. When the light finally came back on, I was sure I saw someone, standing in the shadows near the furnace. It was just a fleeting moment, but I swore I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I felt a rush of fear wash over me. I dropped the flashlight in panic and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I locked it as quickly as I could. My breath was heavy, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I needed to call my parents, but I didn't want to worry them over something that could be nothing. It could have been a mouse or some other animal, but the fear was still there. I didn't know what I had seen in the basement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my phone and tried calling my mom, but there was no answer. I called my dad, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I wasn't sure what to do. I paced back and forth in the living room, my mind racing. The tapping had stopped, but now I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't the same as the fear I had felt earlier. It was deeper, like something was wrong. I decided to go up to my room and try to get some sleep, hoping that whatever I had heard was just my imagination. I went to my room and locked the door behind me. I climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every small sound in the house made me jump. I listened for the tapping again, but it didn't come back. I still felt like something was wrong, though. The house was eerily quiet now, and it made me more nervous. The next day, when my parents returned, I told them what had happened. They didn't seem to take me seriously. They said it was probably just a mouse or some other animal in the walls. They even laughed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew what I had felt. Something wasn't right. I never went back into the basement after that night, and every time I walked past it, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still there. It's been months since that night, but I haven't been able to forget it. I still don't know what was behind the wall or what I saw in the basement, but every time I hear a strange noise in the house, my heart races, and I wonder if I'm not as alone as I think I am.